Welcome to the fourth lecture on religion and global politics. Following on from last week's lecture, which looked at values, we will be looking at an example of a particular set of values and asking the question whether these values are universal. The values in question are the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Please watch the following short video for background explanation to the formation of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?
After World War II, it was clear that the horrors of the war should never be allowed to occur again. Founded in 1945, the United Nations sought to prevent future atrocities by affirming, in its foundational charter, faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and a commitment to promote better standards of life in larger freedom. In the years that followed, member states of the United Nations strived to develop the human rights provisions of the Charter and capture them in a single document. It took 3 years to agree on a common vision. On the 10th of December, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations.
Still, it is the first step in a great evolutionary process. It is the first occasion on which the organised community of nations has made a declaration of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it has the authority of the body of opinion of the United Nations as a whole. And millions of people, men and women and children all over the world, will turn for hope and guidance and inspiration to this document.
While history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration before us may be destined to occupy an honorable place in the procession of positive landmarks in human history.
The declaration consists of a preamble and 30 articles, with Article 1 powerfully proclaiming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No discrimination, right to life, liberty and security, no slavery, no torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, equal protection of the law, no arbitrary arrest, detention or exile, fair and public hearing, no arbitrary interference with privacy, right to freedom of movement, right to seek and enjoy asylum, right to a nationality, right to marry and to found a family, right to property, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, right to take part in government, right to work, right to rest and leisure, right to food, clothing, housing, medical care and social services, right to education, right to participate in cultural life.
These human rights are not country-specific. They are not a reward for good behavior or particular to a certain era or social group. They are the rights of people of every color, from every race and ethnic group, whether or not they have disabilities, citizens or migrants, no matter their sex, their class, their caste, their creed, their age or sexual orientation.
The Declaration has generated action for human rights protection in many ways. It has inspired hundreds of human rights instruments that together constitute international human rights law and a number of international bodies and mechanisms for human rights protection. The principles of the Declaration have supported the decolonization struggle and have been enshrined in the constitutions of the newly established countries which have joined the United Nations. The Declaration has inspired national and regional human rights protection systems, including legislation and institutions. And it continues to guide the work of human rights defenders and advocates worldwide. Today, the Declaration is available in more than 500 languages and dialects, and it has obtained the Guinness World Record for the most translated document in the world. The 10th of December, the day on which the Declaration was adopted, is celebrated each year as Human Rights Day. The Declaration emphasizes the relevance of human rights in our daily lives.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world.
Let us return to the lecture. Please look at the PowerPoint slides. So the lecture would look at whether human rights are universal. The person holding the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the photo, which frames the PowerPoint, is Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of the deceased former president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and was a principal architect of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. However, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was not exclusively based on an American or even Western influence. It included other notable diplomats and thinkers, including Charles Malik, who we saw in the video, who represented Lebanon. This conception of human rights, which emerged from the Holocaust of the Second World War, was designed to provide a universal understanding of human rights, which would accord with a cosmopolitan position. It would be shared amongst all peoples throughout the world, irrespective of color, creed, political ideology, or religion. However, if we are to look at the history of human rights, then we find that the concept had been around at least since the time of the French Revolution. Let me first introduce the key terms which we'll be looking at in the lecture. Firstly, we'll be returning to the concept of cosmopolitanism. Human rights may be an expression of a cosmopolitan belief in universal values. Cosmopolitans, as I introduced to you last week, believe in universal values. Communitarians, on the other hand, do not. They believe that there are no universal values because the world is divided into different communities, and our individual identities are formed by our socialization and participation in these communities. For cosmopolitans, on the other hand, communities are merely associations of individuals who are the basic unit of mankind. The lecture will also introduce you to the concept of rights. Rights may be seen as entitlements or claims. These are usually entitlements or claims made in a political community. Now, as students of this class, general education class on religion and global politics, you also have rights. But these rights, the right to a lecture, a right to a reading, a right to an assignment, can only be claimed within the context of ICU. You cannot go outside of ICU to another university, such as Sophia or Tokyo University or Oxford University or London School of Economics, and claim this right. Similarly, as citizens of Japan, you may have entitlements or claims which you can exercise within the political community of Japan. But you cannot exercise these claims once you leave the physical boundaries of Japan. So if you were to go to China or the United States or South Sudan, you would not have these entitlements, because these entitlements or claims can only be exercised within a particular political community. They are not universal. The term which we give to this political community is the state. Now, human rights are a particular type of rights, whereas rights can be seen as legal claims, a legal entitlement or claim exercised within a particular political community which can recognize that claim and act on that claim in order to enforce it or protect it. Human rights are universal entitlements. They are claims which transcend state borders, which go beyond state borders. This is what makes human rights a particularly important example of cosmopolitan thought. Human rights are exercised in an anarchic world, in a world which is divided into different nation states. However, human rights are based on the understanding that we are all the same. And because we are all the same, and we are all equally endowed with rights and with dignity, we should have the same rights, irrespective of where we live, irrespective of the political community where we reside. As mentioned earlier, the concept of rights was formulated in the 18th century. Of particular importance was the American Bill of Rights, which emerged as a result of the American War of Independence and successful decolonization from the United Kingdom, and the French Revolution and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The picture you can see is the picture of l'Assemblée nationale, which is the French Parliament or House of Congress. It was made up of the deputies of people who represented the sovereign nation of France. L'Assemblée nationale replaced the divine right of kings and queens. It asserted that the nation itself, and not the king or queen, was sovereign. Now, the French Revolution and the American Declaration of the Rights of the American Bill of Rights are very similar documents, but they are different in one key respect. This difference is that in the French Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, the subject of this rights is not merely the citizen, but the rights of man in general. Article 1 of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen argued that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This was applicable to everyone throughout the world, not just Frenchmen or French women. If we look at the United States Bill of Rights, then although Americans are given equal rights, it is exercised only within the political community of the United States of America. These rights may be universal, but they are applicable only within the territories of the United States. Similarly, if we look at Article 3 of the French Declaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, the argument is that this universal right is exercised only within the context of the nation. Article 3 argues that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. So here, in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, we have two articles. The first article puts forward a cosmopolitan belief in the universality of rights. All men, note the gendered language here, all men are born and remain free and equal in rights, whereas Article 3 limits this right to, or subordinates these rights to the principle of the sovereignty of the nation. This gives rise to a question: who are the subjects of human rights? Are they women, meaning men and women in general, or citizens? It is ambiguous if we look at the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which followed the Holocaust, attempted to clarify this distinction between the rights of men, or humankind in general, and the rights of citizens. Its impetus emerged specifically from the Holocaust. The Holocaust refers to the extermination of mainly Jewish people, but also other ethnic minorities such as the Roma, by the National Socialist regime, the Nazi regime, in Germany between 1939 and 1945. What was significant about the Holocaust was that under German law, under the law which the National Socialist regime had implemented and had formulated, it was legal. Jews were stripped of their citizenship. Once they were stripped of their citizenship, there was no legal instrument which could protect them from being exterminated. So the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which emerged after the war, was an attempt to endow all human beings with the same rights, so that if these rights were violated in one member state, then it would be seen as a violation of the rights of mankind in general. So the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, as we saw from the short introductory documentary earlier, was unanimously adopted by the General Assembly in December 1948. I mention unanimously, but there were 2 abstentions. South Africa abstained from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights because they implemented a system of apartheid. Apartheid was based on a separation between the different races within South Africa. It gave rights exclusively to the white minority and not the African majority. So South Africa did not agree with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The other state, which did not ratify the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights, was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia didn't do it because of a very different reason. Unlike South Africa, they did not object to the content of the rights, but they objected to the principle of rights itself. Like, as we'll see later, either in this lecture or the lecture next week, the Vatican, the Saudis argued that rights could only be given by God. We are all subjects of Allah. So even though we may exercise these rights, and even though the Saudis did not have an objection to the content of these rights, they argued that we should acknowledge that these rights are given to us by God and cannot be claimed by mankind itself. The United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights made individual human beings the subject of rights. Under Article 1, which we saw in the documentary earlier, All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Civil and political and social and cultural rights were seen as universal. They both came from this belief that human beings were naturally endowed with reason. Reason makes us rational. Being rational means that we can be autonomous subjects, that we can make decisions on our own behalf. Civil and political rights refer to what we consider to be today basic human rights. Under Article 18 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everybody has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And indeed, this fundamental human right is a right which permits us, in this course, to critically examine the idea of rights itself. Article 19 argued that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. I hope that you will exercise this right in our discussion on Thursday. Article 20 argues that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Notice that because of the novel coronavirus, in many societies and states throughout the world, there are now restrictions on the right to peaceful assembly and association. You are not allowed in many states to gather. And indeed, in Japan itself, it may be seen as an offense for you to congregate in large numbers. Civil and political rights were codified legally in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1966. So these rights were included in a separate document. They are favored mainly by liberal cosmopolitans. Cosmopolitans, as we saw, are those who believe in universal values. Liberals believe in liberty. They believe in the fundamental universal value of freedom. For liberals, freedom is the basic human right. Everyone should have the right to be free. Everybody should have equal rights to freedom. But this does not translate into equality for every human being. There is formal equality, but not substantive equality. Formal equality means we have the same rights. Substantive equality means that there is an equality of outcome. We have the same opportunities to succeed, the same opportunities to graduate, to do well in this course. But that doesn't matter, that doesn't mean that all of us will graduate, will do well in this course, or be successful in getting a job. Economic and social rights, however, are rights to substantive equality. Under Article 23 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everybody has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. What this means is that you all have the same right to work. You all have the same choice. You are free to choose whatever job you want to do. You have a right to just and favorable conditions of work and to some protection against unemployment. Everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. These are codified in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. However, if we are to critically examine these rights, we could ask ourselves the question that whether we really have these rights in practice, not just in theory. It was announced last week that almost 20 million people had lost their jobs within the United States of America. The United States of America is seen as a society which values freedom. Human rights are part of the very fabric of American life and also American foreign policy, at least until President Trump became president in 2016. What about the right to work for these 20 million people who have lost their jobs? Even within Japan, we find unemployment. How can or who can protect you against unemployment within a market economy based on production for profit? Secondly, everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. Even in a society such as Japan, with relatively low levels of unemployment, we find that there is a distinction in pay between the pay which is given to people for the same amount of work according to age and also according to gender. Japan is one of the most unequal societies in the world when it comes to gender empowerment in employment. According to the World Economic Program, women in Japan earn less than half of what men earn, even though many do the same job. Similarly, in many jobs within Japan, you will find that older workers are given more pay than younger workers, even if they have the same job title. The older somebody gets, the more money they will earn, just because they are getting older. This is under the Nenkin system. Unfortunately, you may find this to be the case once you successfully do Shushoku Katsudo and find a job on your own after graduation. Now, economic and social rights are favored by socialist cosmopolitans. Socialists share the same belief in freedom as liberals, but believe that there can be no formal equality without substantive equality. So they're not in favor only of equality of opportunity, they're in favor of equality of outcome, meaning some sort of material equality between human beings. What this shows us is that the very concept of human rights and definition of human rights is itself contested between liberal cosmopolitans and socialist cosmopolitans. This gives rise to a question. Firstly, are human rights universal? Cosmopolitans, whether liberal or socialist, would argue that human rights are universal, that we are all endowed with fundamental human rights, which encompass both civil and political rights and economic and social rights. Communitarians, as we have seen last week, would argue that there are no universal values because our identities are formed as a result of our socialization in particular communities. These particular communities have different values from other communities. Therefore, human rights cannot be universal. If we agree with cosmopolitans that human rights are universal, which rights are universal? Civil and political rights, or economic and social rights, or both? If both, who is responsible for ensuring our human rights? Is it the United Nations? The United Nations itself is comprised of nation states. It is powerless to act without the consent of nation states. Is it the state? If it is our own nation state, then what happens when the nation state itself is a source of human rights abuses? What happens when the nation state does not recognize our rights? These are the questions which I would like you to discuss in your breakout rooms on Thursday. Next week, we will look at a case study of human rights within its birthplace, within France. And we will look at issues related to human rights and religion, a clash between two forms of cosmopolitanism. Religious cosmopolitanism comes in this our case study of Islam, and Republican cosmopolitanism as represented by the French state, the French Republic. See you next week. I hope you have enjoyed the lecture.